The void stretches before me, cold and infinite, a black so deep that even the astronomicon struggles to pierce it. Stars shimmer like distant candles, indifferent to the lives clinging to their worlds, and yet I see movement, echoes of fury and steel that do not belong. I have watched civilizations crumble beneath their own hubris, hives consumed by fire, manufactorums swallowed by the screams of servitors. I have felt the tremor of Xenos invasions and the grinding march of the Astra Militarum, but nothing prepared me for the shadow that moves with the fury of a god unchained. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. The tale I am about to unfold is not of heroes, nor of villains in the simple sense. It is the story of a force of ruin, foreign and unstoppable, tearing through worlds that even the Adeptus Custodes would hesitate to defend. Hives fall silent under its weight. Skitarii falter, their cogitators screaming the futility of resistance, and yet amidst the chaos whispers circulate of something more, a hint that the warp itself recoils at the sight. Is this divine judgment a rumor among the tech priests or merely the nightmare made flesh? We may never know. The air in Hive Tarsus was thick with the acrid bite of promethium and the metallic tang of blood. Smoke curled through shattered streets, painting the towering spires in ghostly orange and black, each shard of glass catching firelight and throwing fractured shadows onto the cracked plasteel beneath. I moved through the alleys with the careful caution of a creature who knows it is prey in a world that had suddenly become predator. From somewhere deep in the hive, a vox grill sputtered static. The message was lost in the tremor of explosions echoing like the heartbeat of a dying planet. Somewhere above, the sound of gunfire, rapid, mechanical, unrelenting, told me the Adeptus Arbites were trying to enforce order, but the order they sought no longer existed. I passed a group of civilians crouched in a collapsed underpass, their eyes wide and uncomprehending, clutching children whose faces were streaked with soot and tears. A mother whispered prayers to the Emperor, words so hurried they became a breathless litany, and I felt the weight of hopeless faith pressing against the walls of that crumbling structure. Their terror was a mirror of my own. The streets were littered with the discarded tools of survival, scorched data slates, cracked canisters of water, even the occasional servo skull, its eyepiece shattered, rolling uselessly across the ground. It was impossible to tell what had caused this destruction, only that it moved with purpose, each step leaving a trail of ruin that no imperial law could touch. As I navigated the maze of wreckage, I saw the first of the survivors who had not yet fled entirely into the underways. A group of Skitarii, their limbs clanking with augmented precision, advanced methodically down a boulevard that had become a corridor of death. They scanned, their red ocular lenses cutting through the haze, but even their cogitators seemed strained against the anomaly that moved ahead of them. Every shot fired met only air. Every trap laid was ignored, as if the city itself were being rewritten beneath their feet. And then I caught it. A shadow moving faster than any human could. A silhouette that seemed too large for mere flesh. Muscles and sinew illuminated in the glow of burning manufactorums. It tore through a barricade like it had been spun from wind and fury, leaving only shattered steel and screaming citizens in its wake. I remember the sound most vividly, not a roar, not a growl, but a deep resonant vibration that seemed to resonate through bone and plasteel alike. It was the warning that the hive had already fallen in spirit, even if its people still clung to fragile routines. The Adeptus Arbites tried to rally, their batons and bolt guns a testament to law in the face of chaos. But the force was relentless, tearing through ranks with godlike strength. I saw one Arbitee sergeant lifted from the ground and thrown against a wall. His armor crumpled under the impact, yet his vox grill still sputtered, screaming for reinforcements that would not arrive. The civilians scattered into the underways, their hurried footsteps echoing off steel walls only to find that nowhere was safe. I ducked behind a broken pillar, my breath shallow, my hands slick with soot, and I realized that the hive was no longer a city but a graveyard in progress. The firelight illuminated the horrors around me, Twisted metal, severed limbs, and the occasional servitor. Its mechanisms halted mid-task as if frozen in terror. A whisper ran through the rubble, a rumor carried on the wind. Some said it was the return of an ancient warrior, a being whose wrath the Imperium could not contain. Others claimed it was the herald of something far older, a portent from the warp itself. I forced myself to move, each step a prayer and a calculation. Smoke stung my eyes, filling my lungs with heat and ash, but I pressed on, guided by a mixture of instinct and necessity. In the distance, a manufactorum exploded, sending molten promethium cascading into the streets below. The heat was unbearable, the roar deafening. Yet even as the destruction advanced, the shadow's movement seemed almost purposeful, deliberate. I glimpsed the aftermath of its passing. Doors ripped from their hinges, walls caved inward, vox grills sparking with static. Every trace spoke of power beyond comprehension, a force unconcerned with the lives it obliterated. And yet, amid the carnage, there were moments of fragile humanity. A pair of children huddled beneath the carcass of a broken transport, whispering prayers to saints I had never heard of, their voices trembling, but unbroken. An Arbit's officer dragged a wounded comrade into the shadows, his armor scorched, his eyes wild but focused. These small acts of resilience were as luminous as the infernos consuming the hive. Fleeting sparks in a world being remade by violence. I knew then that survival here was not about strength or weaponry, or even faith. It was about moving through terror without letting it crush your spirit, about finding the edge between despair and the instinct to endure. I left Hive Tarsus behind as the fires burned, the screams echoing in my mind long after the structures crumbled from view. Above, the stars remained indifferent, distant beacons to a galaxy that did not care for human suffering. Yet I could feel it. The shadow, the unbound force, was moving onward, through worlds and systems indifferent to the imperial hierarchy, to the Adeptus Mechanicus, to the Astra Militarum. The hive was just the beginning, a first stanza in a symphony of ruin. And somewhere deep inside me, I knew that what followed would not merely challenge the Imperium's armies, but its very conception of order, faith, and hope. The clang of servo limbs against plasteel echoed like an unholy hymn across the desolate streets of Hive Tarsus. The Skitarii moved with mechanical precision, their augmented bodies reflecting the weak light of fire-streaked skies, the crimson glow of their ocular lenses slicing through the smoke-choked haze. Magos Dominus Calvrix oversaw their deployment from an elevated platform, fingers tracing schematics on a cracked data slate, as if the patterns of destruction could be calculated and contained. Yet even his cogitator-driven mind faltered at the reality before him. The anomaly they faced was not a foe bound by conventional understanding. It moved too fast, struck with unpredictable force, and left devastation in ways no calculation could anticipate. The Adeptus Mechanicus had sent the most disciplined units they could muster, the vanguard of their Martian legions, but each step forward revealed the futility of preparation. Entire districts had been reduced to skeletal frameworks, spires twisted into grotesque parodies of architecture, and within the ruins, pockets of the hive's citizens cowered. Yet the Skitarii advanced relentlessly, their loyalty unyielding, their augmentations compensating for the fear their flesh and blood counterparts could not resist. It was an eerie parade, clanking, whirring, eyes glowing red, ritualistic and deadly. Every servo arm, every arc laser, every stim-injected soldier carried the precision of the cult Mechanicus, yet precision alone could not predict what waited in the smoke. Explosions erupted in the distance, shaking the ground under the Skitarii's feet. Buildings already hollowed by prior assaults crumbled with a sound that seemed almost mournful. Calvrix's voice, amplified through vox grills, issued orders in a tone both clinical and urgent. Yet even he hesitated before deploying the Magos-augmented constructs into zones of immediate destruction. These were streets no human, or even machine guided by human reason, had any right to navigate. And yet they moved forward, firing systematically, deploying arcane devices meant to ensnare, immobilize, or destroy. Yet the foe, if it could be called that, ignored all anticipation. It flowed through the Skitarii ranks like a tempest, leaving shredded armor and ruptured circuitry in its wake. In one corridor of devastation, a squad of vanguard Skitarii was caught in a sudden onslaught. A hulking shadow smashed through the barricades with a single devastating motion, tossing servitors like rag dolls. The squad's arc rifles fired in unison, a pattern of deadly precision designed to maximize lethality. Yet the assault passed through them as though they were air itself. Sparks flew from severed limbs and ruptured power conduits. Magos Calvrix observed the carnage with the detached focus of someone cataloging an anomaly in real time. Yet even he could not suppress the pang of unease. He whispered to himself, a litany of prayers and calculations that no longer seemed sufficient. The survivors of the hive, watching from the shadows, could only glimpse glimpses of the Skitarii vanguard's methodical approach. They saw the unerring march, the unflinching adherence to orders, yet they also saw the futility etched into each frame. Civilians began whispering rumors, voices trembling as much from fear as awe. Some claimed the intruder was a god in flesh, others that it was a herald of the warp, something both impossible and inevitable. Even the most devout could not reconcile the destruction with the Emperor's will. And in those whispers, the first seeds of doubt took root. Amidst the chaos, a small unit of Skitarii infiltrators made their way toward a manufactorum still half standing. They moved with silent efficiency, scanning for arcana, signaling for reinforcements, their cogitators silently cataloging every scrap of debris and every thermal anomaly. The air was heavy with the stench of burning synth flesh, the coppery tang of blood, and the acidic scent of promethium. Yet their sensors reported only fragments, glimpses of movement that were too fast to quantify. One veteran, his bionic eyes glowing brighter than the others, whispered into his vox chamber a single phrase repeated as though it were a protective charm. "It is not of this world. It is not of this world." Calvrix realized then that the war they had been trained for, the disciplined campaigns, the algorithmic strategies, and the centuries of mechanized combat experience, were irrelevant against a force that transcended them. Each move felt like a rehearsal in futility, each calculation doomed to inaccuracy. The streets themselves seemed to resist, structural collapses occurring just moments too early, fires igniting with a terrifying prescience. The anomaly was not merely physical, it shaped reality around it, bending the hive and the instruments of the Mechanicus into patterns that defied prediction. And yet, they pressed on. Because in the machine mind of the Skitarii, there is no surrender, no hesitation beyond the parameters of logic, and even in the face of incomprehensible destruction, there is duty. Magos Calvrix, observing the aftermath of yet another failed suppression, recorded every anomaly, every shred of data, every pattern in the ruin, knowing that this report would be sent up the chain to the higher echelons of the Mechanicus, even if it only served as a testament to failure. Each step forward was a defiance, a declaration that the Imperium, through flesh or machine, would endure, even if the cost was the annihilation of a single hive world. And in that persistence, in the grinding mechanical march of soldiers bound to ritual and obedience, there was a strange resonance with the force they opposed. Not kinship, not understanding, but recognition, something beyond flesh and logic, yet something that acknowledged resistance, however futile. The Skitarii advanced, the fires of Hive Tarsus burning in the background, and for a brief fleeting moment the void seemed to hesitate, as if it too paused to measure the unrelenting precision of humanity's will expressed through circuitry, steel, and unwavering devotion. The hive had fallen in spirit, yet the march continued. The shadow moved onward, the Skitarii moved onward, and the galaxy watched in silent anticipation, wondering if either would endure beyond the next heartbeat of destruction. By the time the Skitarii reached the outskirts of the shattered hive, a different kind of fear had begun to take hold, one that no armor or cogitator could withstand. It was the unease of the unseen, a presence that lingered in the edges of perception, twisting shadows and bending the minds of those who dared to observe too closely. Librarians stationed at the hive's upper tiers had begun to report aberrations in the psychic field, bursts of energy that did not correspond to known warp currents, visions that flickered like broken data slates, and echoes of whispers that could not be traced to any living speaker. The warp was restless, and its restlessness spoke of something extraordinary, something beyond the scope of imperial doctrine. In the data vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, fragments of old liturgies were hastily cross-referenced with accounts from other sectors. Cryptic passages in forbidden tomes spoke of an entity whose presence defied classification, a being of immense wrath and strength, unbound by conventional laws and whose mere passage left the warp itself quivering. Scholars argued in heated whispers, each attempting to reconcile the evidence with accepted truths. Yet none could deny the patterns. Worlds reduced to skeletal remains, energy signatures that spiked far beyond known weapons, and an almost ritualistic precision in the devastation, as though the entity carried a message written in fire and steel. The survivors who managed to escape the initial onslaught told stories with voices trembling like hissing vox static. Some swore the intruder moved like a storm incarnate, bending time and space around its strikes, appearing simultaneously in multiple locations before vanishing without warning. Others claimed it was more than mortal, a being who did not bleed, did not breathe, yet bore the fury of a god unshackled. These accounts filtered through the Mechanicus net, the whispering vox channels and the scribes' reports, coalescing into a rumor that seemed to grow heavier with each retelling. What was once dismissed as hysteria began to harden into a tangible dread, a shadowed presence in the collective consciousness of the hive's remaining citizens. Among the psychers, the whispers were far more disturbing. A junior astropath stationed in a ruined communications tower reported hearing voices in the warp, ancient, angry, and fractured. They spoke in languages long forgotten, fragments of dead tongues entwined with the pulse of the astronomicon itself. The young psyker collapsed repeatedly under the psychic strain, murmuring words that made even the most hardened tech priests flinch. It sees us. It measures our faith. It knows the pattern of our prayers. The magos overseeing the astropathical network noted these transmissions with clinical detachment, yet even he could not mask the flicker of apprehension in his ocular implants. Something had entered the galaxy that defied understanding, and every attempt to contain or classify it only deepened the uncertainty. In the hive's underways, whispers passed among those hiding in the shadows. The survivors called it the Fury or the Unbound, words spoken with reverence, fear, and awe. Children who had never known anything beyond the hive's crushing confines spoke of it as a storm of shadows and steel, a force that arrived without warning and left only silence in its wake. Parents tried to quiet them, telling tales of the Emperor's protection, yet even their voices faltered under the weight of reality. The air seemed to hum with anticipation, charged by a tension that could not be dissipated by prayer or reason. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, Magos Calvrix convened a council of his most trusted lieutenants. Screens flickered with data from surviving Vox relays, showing patterns of destruction that repeated across the hive in seemingly deliberate symmetry. Sensors had picked up energy readings inconsistent with any known Xenos technology, any human-made weapon, or even sanctioned Imperial ordnance. It is as though the pattern of war itself has been rewritten, one veteran tech priest whispered, his hands trembling over a conduit, unsure if he prayed to the Omnissiah or merely to stave off madness. Rumors spread that this being was a fragment of some ancient warrior, a myth reborn, or perhaps a herald of the warp's own judgment. The very notion of apotheosis, of a godlike figure moving through the material realm, began to creep into even the most disciplined minds. And yet all this speculation could not account for the tangible evidence of destruction, the burned-out manufactorums, the scorched streets, the void left in the psyche of every witness. The anomaly was both legend and fact, rumor and reality intertwined so tightly that even the most skeptical could not untangle them. As night fell over the remnants of Hive Tarsus, the survivors huddled in silence, listening to the distant echoes of destruction. Some prayed, some trembled, and some simply stared into the void, feeling the weight of something far older and more powerful than they could name. The warp trembled in anticipation. The stars themselves seemed to dim in recognition. And I understood that the galaxy had not merely been challenged. It had been observed by a force whose motives, methods, and origin were unknowable. The Skitarii would continue to march, the Adeptus Mechanicus would continue to analyze, but the whispers from the warp made clear that nothing about this encounter would ever be the same. And in the silent dread of that night, the unspoken truth became undeniable. This was not a mere incursion. This was a herald of annihilation, a force moving with divine indifference, and the galaxy would tremble beneath it long before any understanding could catch up. The hive had fallen, the Skitarii had marched, and the warp had whispered its warning. The story was only beginning, and the shadow moved on. The news arrived like a shockwave through the segmentum, carried on fragmented Vox relays and intercepted astropathic messages. Hive worlds that had never known conflict beyond local gang wars, manufactorums untouched for centuries, and lightly garrisoned agri-worlds were burning. Each report told the same story. Entire districts reduced to molten ruin, servitors crushed under forces that should not exist, and populations fleeing into the void of underways and tunnels, only to be met with fire and shadow. The anomaly was no longer a single storm confined to Hive Tarsus. It had become a tidal wave, consuming star systems one by one, moving with a precision and relentlessness that made even the most disciplined admirals question the efficacy of the Imperial Navy. From the deck of a cruiser orbiting the dying world of Veshka Secundus, Admiral Raylan watched the burnished glow of orbiting manufactorums collapse into clouds of smoke and flame. His hands gripped the railing, knuckles white beneath armored gauntlets as Vox feeds from planetary governors crackled with panic. "It is impossible," one governor whispered. "It should not exist." And yet the evidence was undeniable. Entire hive clusters had been reduced to skeletal frames in hours, their inhabitants either slaughtered, consumed, or vanished. Communications were failing faster than the Navy could respond. The Emperor's guidance, transmitted faintly through the Astronomicon, seemed pale, a weak flicker against the tidal inferno sweeping across the segmentum. The Adeptus Mechanicus scrambled to respond, dispatching fleets of Skitari, servitor battalions, and arcane defensive constructs. Magos Dominus Calvrix coordinated remotely, his mind a lattice of calculations and predictive algorithms. Yet each engagement ended the same. The intruder, moving faster than any fleet could intercept, tearing through defenses with the ease of wind through reeds. Reports of entire planetary defense grids annihilated in minutes, reactor cores reduced to molten slag, and containment fields shattered like glass spread across his console. Every pattern Calvrix devised was rendered obsolete before it could be enacted. It was not merely physical dominance. It was an intelligence that seemed to anticipate, to read the very structure of Imperial resistance and exploit it with terrifying exactitude. Across the systems, Psychers began reporting anomalies in the warp tied directly to the destruction. The echoes of screaming populations reverberated in psychic resonance, magnified through the Astronomicon and twisted by unseen currents. Some spoke of visions in which the anomaly appeared simultaneously in multiple sectors, leaving fire and ruin in its wake. Others whispered that entire stars flickered in response to its passage, the light dimming for brief moments as if the universe itself recoiled in recognition. The Inquisition took note, but even the Ordo Malleus found little evidence beyond the devastation and the trembling in the warp. The anomaly, it seemed, was indifferent to classification or decree, and yet rumors persisted. Among the scattered survivors in the corridors of abandoned manufactorums and the ruins of hives, they spoke of it as a being both divine and profane. Some claimed it moved with purpose, leaving behind a pattern only comprehensible to those attuned to the rhythms of the warp. Others said it was a judgment, a punishment, a storm of righteous fury, born from forgotten myths of the galaxy. Even among the Adeptus Mechanicus, where logic and reason usually held sway, there were whispers that this was no mere Xenos threat, no rogue psyker, no fragment of chaos, but something older, stronger, and unbound. Fleets that dared to intercept were obliterated, their hulls torn asunder before boarding actions could even be launched. Naval officers reported seeing glimpses of a figure, or multiple figures, moving across battlefields and streets alike, leaving trails of fire and destruction that could not be reconciled with known physics. The Vox channels buzzed with the static of failed transmissions and desperate appeals for aid. The Emperor's light seemed distant, the Imperium's command fractured by the speed and scale of the onslaught. In the underways of dying hives, those who survived watched the fires climb ever higher, their faces illuminated in the orange glow, eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Children clung to mothers. Fathers dragged the injured through twisting corridors, and the smell of burning flesh and melting plasteel choked the air. The hive was no longer a city but a cathedral of ruin, a testament to the incomprehensible power moving through the galaxy. And yet, amid the chaos, a strange, almost reverent awe took hold. For all the fire, all the screams, all the annihilation, the anomaly did not pause to gloat. It moved forward with relentless purpose, as if the galaxy itself were a chessboard and each planet, each fleet, each citizen, a mere piece in a game beyond mortal understanding. Terra remained distant, the golden throne eternal but silent, the astronomican faint against the storm of destruction. The fires beyond Terra would burn long and bright, a warning and a reckoning, and the Imperium would have to answer, or collapse. The devastation spreading across the segmentum brought memories, old, half-forgotten, buried beneath centuries of doctrine and ritual. On worlds that had survived centuries of Xenos incursions, civil uprisings, and localized rebellions, the scale of destruction now mirrored nothing in recorded history. Imperial historians, scribes, and archivists scrambled to recall anything comparable, flipping through data slates that crackled under the weight of incoming reports. There were fragments, whispers of lost wars and half-forgotten exterminatus campaigns, but none could match the sheer audacity and power of what was unfolding. The galaxy seemed to be repeating some ancient catastrophe, a cycle of annihilation encoded in forgotten ages. On the agri-world of Carson IV, a lone Imperial historian named Thyleos combed through archival records of hive collapses and Xenos invasions. His data slates hummed with static as he compared the anomalies of the present with accounts of the Horus Heresy, the Thramma's Crusades, and the shadowed conflicts of the Age of Apostasy. None matched. This destruction moved faster, struck harder, and carried a precision that made even the most devastating Xeno sieges seem amateurish by comparison. Thalios scrolled through half-erased accounts of ancient psyker cataclysms and demon incursions, but the patterns were inconsistent. Yet the fear, the awe, the inevitable sense of loss that he realized had persisted across the centuries. The galaxy had always whispered warnings, and now the whispers had become a roar. Survivors on burning hives spoke of shadows they could not comprehend, figures larger than men, moving with the precision of a calculated storm. Some claimed that these forms mirrored ancient legends, warriors of impossible strength who had once walked the stars, entities spoken of only in liturgies and fragmented psalms. Whether these were the ghosts of myth or the crude imaginings of terrified minds, the effect was the same. The Imperium citizens found themselves confronted with both history and prophecy, unable to separate fact from interpretation. Children drew images on scorched walls of monstrous forms, unknowingly echoing the iconography of old sainted warriors, while scribes documented the resemblance with trembling hands. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, the echoes of the past were less poetic but no less urgent. Magos Dominus Calvrix cross-referenced contemporary destruction, with records of failed planetary defenses and abandoned warp anomalies. He found a disquieting consistency. Each historical catastrophe had been accompanied by rumors of a being so powerful that it reshaped the understanding of war itself. The difference now was immediacy. The force moving across the segmentum was no relic or story. It was here, tangible, unstoppable, and bending reality around it in ways the Mechanicus had only theorized in the most extreme treatises. Even the Inquisition, ever cautious in their pronouncements, could not ignore the resonance of history. Ordo Malleus agents reported psychic tremors echoing the patterns of ancient demon invasions, while Ordo Xenos operatives saw a force that defied classification, its violence exceeding anything the galaxy had catalogued. The echoes of the past were not merely memories, they were warnings, ghosted templates of catastrophe that hinted at the inevitability of what might follow if the Imperium failed to act. Each chronicle, each fragment of record seemed to whisper, "History does not forgive hesitation." In the field, survivors told stories that merged present terror with ancient myth. On Veshka Secundus, a child's terrified gaze fixed on a towering figure silhouetted against the burning manufactorums, and she whispered a name she had heard only in bedtime psalms, a name centuries old. It was meaningless to the uninitiated, but to those attuned to the currents of faith the words carried resonance, a thread connecting memory, myth, and the present. The galaxy had always feared the recurrence of impossible beings, but now, it seemed, that recurrence was manifest. Amid the fires and ruin, the Imperium could feel the weight of time pressing down upon it. There was no certainty, only patterns, fragments, and echoes that seemed to demand recognition. Battles fought and lost, worlds scorched, civilizations obliterated. All were threads woven into a tapestry of understanding too vast and too terrible to comprehend fully. And through it all, the anomaly pressed onward, indifferent to history yet somehow entwined with it, as though the galaxy's past were a prologue and the present a test. In the hollowed streets beneath the twisted remains of manufactorums and shattered spires, one truth became evident. The Imperium had faced horrors before, but nothing like this. The ghosts of the past whispered warnings, urging caution, precision, and faith. But faith alone could not shield the living from what was coming. And as the fires climbed higher, illuminating the ruins in a hellish glow, it became clear that the galaxy was witnessing history written in blood, steel, and shadow, and that even the oldest echoes could not prepare it for what lay ahead. The air was thick with incense and the metallic tang of fear, a scent that clung to the stone corridors of the hives like a living entity. Chaplains moved among the Astra Militarum and surviving civilians, their power swords reflecting the flickering light of fires that consumed entire sectors. They chanted litanies, recited prayers to the Emperor, and struck at the weak-willed with words meant to steel hearts against despair. Yet even their voices trembled. Faith, the unyielding bedrock of the Imperium, was cracking beneath the relentless advance of a force that seemed to disregard the very laws of divine and mortal order alike. On the steps of a ruined cathedral, a commissar addressed a dwindling company of guardsmen, his voice hoarse but authoritative. He urged them to remember the Emperor's glory, to stand fast, and to fight even when hope seemed extinguished. The men obeyed, bolters raised and bayonets at the ready, yet the hesitation in their eyes betrayed what the chaplains feared most: doubt. Each soldier felt it, a gnawing certainty that their actions might be meaningless, that prayer might be insufficient against a power that devoured worlds as easily as the sun swallows the horizon. In the upper galleries, priests of the Ministorum struggled to maintain ritual. Their fingers trembled over sacred relics, and the hymnals slipped from hands slick with ash. Even the most devout among them confessed in whispers that the Emperor's light felt distant, dimmed by the enormity of the calamity. Statues of saints and martyrs cast grotesque shadows across broken pews, seeming almost to leer at the faithful. Every echo of flame and explosion was a reminder that the Imperium's godlike protector might be absent when needed most. Some psychers and scholars turned to forbidden texts, scouring apocryphal records and ancient litanies for answers. They found hints, fragments that suggested the existence of beings whose wrath rivaled that of the Emperor himself, creatures capable of reshaping matter and bending time to their will. Their studies were secret, performed in trembling hands, and under tight surveillance, for such speculation bordered on heresy. Yet the more they studied, the clearer it became. The galaxy faced an adversary that was as much metaphysical as it was physical. Faith, they realized, could not shield them entirely. It could only sustain the spirit while the body fell. Among the civilians, doubt festered like a disease. Mothers clutched children, whispering prayers while simultaneously questioning the promises of millennia. Fathers, armed with nothing but improvised weapons, looked at the encroaching shadows and wondered whether the Emperor's protection had abandoned them. Even in the lowest underways, in the hidden corners of the hive, whispered conversations revealed the strain. Some wondered whether the Adeptus Ministorum had lied about divine omnipotence, whether the rituals performed on Terra and across the stars were merely gestures with no effect on reality. In the chambers of surviving noble houses where wealth and privilege had once offered illusionary safety, the elite found themselves similarly shaken. Servitors moved silently, performing sacred rites and delivering messages of hope from distant sectors, but their mechanical voices could not soothe the gnawing terror. Religious advisors muttered prayers to obscure saints, their words lost in the roar of distant explosions. Every report of annihilation, every vision of incomprehensible power, eroded the foundation upon which generations had built their certainty. That the Emperor's will was absolute and unassailable. Even within the ranks of the Skitarii, where logic and machine supplanted doubt, traces of uncertainty appeared. Sensors picked up anomalies in psychic resonance, patterns that did not align with known physics or predicted behavior. The force, moving through the galaxy, seemed to skirt the edges of reality, and while the Skitarii could catalog, analyze, and predict, they could not reconcile these deviations with reason. The Omnissiah's creations operated with precision, Yet precision alone could not interpret faith, fear, or the metaphysical tremors rippling across the hive. By the time night fell over the burning sectors, the Imperium's faith, once a monolith, steadfast and unyielding, was fractured. Liturgies were recited with trembling voices, prayers were whispered through clenched teeth, and holy symbols were raised to the sky that offered no answer. The anomaly moved onward, indifferent to belief or ritual, a force whose existence rendered centuries of piety, doctrine, and divine certainty inadequate. And yet within the broken faith a strange resilience began to emerge. Even as doubt gnawed at the soul, the spirit of mankind endured, clinging to hope with teeth and nails. For in the darkest night, the will to survive is sometimes the only prayer that truly matters. The fires illuminated the broken cityscape in hellish hues, casting long shadows of soldiers, priests, and civilians alike. Somewhere in the distance, the unbound force advanced, its path unerring, leaving the scent of brimstone and scorched flesh in its wake. And as the night deepened, one realization became undeniable. Faith alone could not stop the coming storm. Yet even fractured, the Imperium's belief was a flame the void could not fully consume. The horizon was ablaze with fire and molten metal, the remnants of Hive Tarsus now a charred skeleton beneath a sky streaked with ash, and the distant glow of Prometheum explosions. Across the shattered boulevards, the first full-scale engagements began. Lehman Russ battle tanks rumbled into the streets, treads grinding over rubble, their hulls streaked with soot and scorched by distant blasts. Armored squads of the Astra, Militarum pressed forward behind them, bolters raised, lasguns sweeping in disciplined arcs, while chaplains moved among them, their shrill exhortations cutting through the roar of war like blades. And in the distance the shadows shifted. The anomaly advanced with terrifying inevitability. It moved too quickly for the guardsmen to track, its presence palpable in the shuddering air, the way plasteel buckled under unseen force. Skitarii units fired volleys of arc weapons, their precision honed over centuries. Yet the being seemed to absorb, deflect, or entirely ignore the most lethal attacks. Magos Calvrix's augmented auguries flickered in alarm as he recorded each failed attempt to impede the destructive path, noting the uncanny timing and strategy that could not belong to any Xenos or human mind. It was not just power. It was calculation, and yet there was no discernible rationale, only the inevitability of obliteration. A detachment of Adeptus Custodes arrived in the lower spire districts, their gold and crimson armor gleaming in the infernal light. They moved as a single organism, blades drawn, shields raised, every gesture a study in martial perfection. Even, they paused at the sight of the entity advancing, its speed and strength defying every precedent. A single custodian engaged, slashing through reinforced barricades only to be thrown back with a force that resonated through bone and armor alike. The clash was brief but monumental, a collision of mythic scale, human perfection against something that seemed to surpass even the Emperor's own martial ideal. Amid the chaos, the Hive's civilians moved through tunnels and subways, their terror palpable, the sound of their footsteps and cries a constant undertone to the mechanical fury above. The fire reflected off broken walls, casting long shadows that seemed almost alive, dancing with the devastation. Children screamed. Mothers shielded infants, and fathers brandished improvised weapons with hands trembling more from fear than strength. And through it all, the anomaly carved a path of absolute destruction, as if each act of survival were merely a spark in a storm designed to consume every ember. In one courtyard, a squad of Imperial guardsmen attempted a coordinated strike, laying explosives in an attempt to trap the force between walls. They detonated the charges in unison, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as though their plan might succeed. Then came the pulse of raw energy, a blast that flung men, tanks, and debris alike into the air. The courtyard was obliterated, the concrete and steel pulverized into dust, leaving nothing recognizable behind. Survivors crawled through the wreckage, some screaming, some muttering prayers, all of them aware that their understanding of war had failed, that the rules had been rewritten before their eyes. Skitarii reinforcements arrived, augmented with heavier war gear, their arc lasers painting streaks of death across the smoke. They coordinated with the Astra Militarum in a desperate attempt to funnel the anomaly into a kill zone, but each maneuver was anticipated and nullified. The entity moved with both brute strength and cunning, its strikes surgical yet chaotic, leaving only devastation and echoes of despair. Magos Calvrix observed from an elevated position, scribes and data slaves recording every fragment of information, noting anomalies in movement and energy dispersion. Each failed containment was a testament to the gulf between mortal strategy and something beyond mortal comprehension. By nightfall, the hive was a battlefield of molten ruin and shattered hope. Bolt guns lay discarded, armor twisted, and the echoes of psychic screams ricocheted off half-destroyed spires. And yet, through the chaos, the Imperium fought with stubborn resolve. Soldiers, Skitarii, and Custodes alike held positions, buying seconds where none could be spared. The clash was not merely physical, it was philosophical, a struggle between order and chaos, faith and fear, mortality and a force that defied all understanding. As the fires illuminated the carnage, a chilling realization took hold. This was not a skirmish, not a battle to be won or lost. It was a reckoning, a test of endurance and will, and the galaxy was only beginning to measure the scale of what it faced. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the entity advanced, unyielding and incomprehensible, while the Imperium, for all its discipline, faith, and firepower, began to understand that in this war, survival was victory enough, and the future would be forged in ashes and steel. The screams began long before the fires reached the upper tiers of the hive, not the shrieks of mortals caught in the open, nor the panicked cries of guardsmen under siege, but the whispers that clawed directly at the mind. Psychers stationed in observation towers, their robes singed from heat and ash, reported visions that left them trembling, mouths mumbling prayers they did not understand. The warp itself seemed to recoil in anticipation, shifting currents in ways that made navigation of the Astronomicon uncertain. Even the most disciplined minds of the Adeptus Mechanicus faltered, as the anomaly's influence bent not just matter, but perception, thought, and the fragile bonds of reality. I walked through a corridor of the hive that had once been administrative offices, now a twisting labyrinth of smoke, fire, and shards of glass. There were bodies, yes, but more pervasive were the traces of minds broken by what they had witnessed. A vox priest, his face pale beneath his hood, whispered through static-laced channels about visions of towers toppling in impossible directions, of armies dissolving into shadow, and of creatures so vast that the stars themselves seemed to bend under their gaze. His voice faltered as he confessed to seeing his own death repeated countless times in fragmented, shifting sequences, as if reality had folded itself into a cruel mockery of foresight. Across the hive, psychers in the field became unpredictable. Some collapsed outright, their psychic energies flaring in uncontrolled bursts that set debris and plasteel ablaze. Others, driven to delirium, began speaking in tongues of dead languages, invoking names of entities long buried in myth and forbidden texts. The Adeptus Mechanicus documented these anomalies meticulously, their cogitators recording every spike in psychic disturbance, every tremor in the warp, but no calculation could make sense of it. Every pattern led only to more questions, every answer fractured into new enigmas. Among the survivors, the psychological toll was evident. Children refused to speak, pressing their faces against scorched walls as if trying to hide from something far larger than mortal comprehension. Soldiers, once disciplined, moved with hesitation, a twitch of fear in their steps betraying the certainty that death was no longer predictable. Faith faltered under the weight of incomprehensible destruction. Prayers fell flat, the words empty against a reality that had been warped and shattered. Even chaplains, icons of devotion and resilience, admitted in whispered confessions that doubt now gnawed at their resolve. Magos Calvrix observed the patterns through a network of Skitarii and servo skulls, noting how the anomaly's movement seemed designed not merely to destroy, but to induce terror and confusion. Tactical formations dissolved under its influence. Strategies meticulously devised became irrelevant as soldiers froze, eyes wide with disbelief, and psychers screamed in resonance with the shifting warp. The battlefield became as much a psychological crucible as a physical one. The entity was reshaping not only cities and armies, but minds themselves. There were reports, too, of visions shared across vast distances. A psyker on a distant agri-world described seeing the same tableau as one trapped in the underways of Hive Tarsus. A figure moving like liquid steel, flames bending around it, shadows clawing at the very sky. The reports were catalogued, analyzed, and then dismissed by many as delusions. but the repetition was impossible to ignore. The entity's presence was a psychic imprint, a resonance that reached beyond the local, a force that could fracture perception across light years, leaving the mind as devastated as the physical world. In the aftermath of these psychic assaults, survivors were left hollow, eyes wide but empty, murmuring fragments of visions they could not piece together. Soldiers questioned orders they had once followed without hesitation. Priests debated the meaning of prayers unanswered. History seemed inadequate, myths insufficient, and even the Astronomican's distant light offered only faint guidance. The galaxy was witnessing the unmaking of certainty itself, the slow erosion of all that had anchored thought, faith, and purpose. By dawn, Hive Tarsus was not merely a city in ruin, it was a monument to shattered psyche and fractured reality. Smoke hung in the air like a veil, muting colors and silencing the world beneath. Yet through the ash and madness there was still a faint heartbeat of defiance, the will to endure, to fight, to witness, even when reason faltered. And in that fragile spark lay the tenuous hope that humanity might yet survive. Even as its perception of reality was being irrevocably rewritten, the entity moved with a purpose that defied comprehension, a predator beyond scale or measure, leaving worlds reduced to ash in its wake. Fleet commanders across the segmentum struggled to track its path, their strategies undone before they could be executed. Cruisers and battle barges were dispatched, bolstered by boarding torpedoes and waves of disciplined infantry. Yet every attempt at interception failed. The anomaly eluded them as if it existed partly outside the constraints of space itself, phasing between attacks, slipping through volleys of torpedoes, and leaving nothing behind but ruins and the scent of burning promethium. On the surface of Hestia 4, where a combined force of Astra Militarum and Scitarii attempted to establish a defensive line, the relentless pursuit became visible in the form of devastation. Bolt guns cracked, blast cannons flared, and servitors discharged power into barriers and traps. Yet the entity advanced, seemingly aware of every ambush. Entire regiments were obliterated in moments, shields torn asunder, walls collapsed, and artillery ripped from their mounts, tossed aside as if the laws of mass and momentum were mere suggestions. It was a hunting ground, and the Imperium's finest were mere prey in a cosmic game they could not perceive. In the command chamber of a beleaguered planetary governor, the situation was grave. Reports came in through scrambled Vox channels, fragmented and urgent. Each sector that reported destruction had fallen within hours. The anomaly's movement was methodical, tracing lines across the segmentum that suggested strategy without reason, intelligence without empathy. Advisors argued heatedly, their logic faltering in the face of evidence, and the governor's own hand shook as he traced the courses on a hollow display. He realized the truth the others could not admit. No amount of imperial might could halt what was coming. Magos Dominus Calvrix, coordinating Scitarii movements across multiple battle zones, noted the same phenomenon. Sensors recorded instantaneous displacements, energy bursts that bypassed shields, and destruction patterns that mirrored the initial strike on Hive Tarsus. The anomaly did not merely attack, it manipulated, it adapted, it measured. Each encounter produced data, yet the conclusions drawn only reinforced the futility of conventional warfare. It was not an enemy to be fought in the traditional sense. It was an inevitability, an unstoppable convergence of force and intent. On the ground, soldiers fled or froze, eyes wide in terror, witnessing the anomaly dismantle everything they understood about war. Some claimed it could see through their very intentions, anticipating actions before they could be executed. A corporal muttered in disbelief, "It knows what we'll do before we even think it," and the word spread among his comrades like a contagion. In the shadows of burned manufactorums, psychers whispered of a being that resonated with the warp itself, moving not just through matter but through thought, preempting strategies, predicting maneuvers, and annihilating with terrifying foresight. Even the civilian population, huddled in underways and tunnels, felt the pursuit. Fires lit the streets above, and every rumble of debris was a reminder that the force was coming. Mothers clutched children tighter, priests muttered hurried litanies, and soldiers prayed to the emperor for a miracle that did not arrive. It was relentless in its sweep, unyielding in its path, and utterly indifferent to the Imperium's pleas or warnings. Each world left behind was a monument to its unstoppable drive, a testament to the impossibility of interception. By the third day of relentless pursuit, The Imperium's response had fragmented. Fleets retreated, regiments collapsed into defensive pockets, and Magos Calvarix's calculations grew increasingly desperate, seeking variables that did not exist. The anomaly's path was no longer a pattern of attack, it was a statement. A proof of inevitability, a demonstration that even the vast machinery of the Imperium, with all its faith, firepower, and devotion, was subordinate to a force that transcended comprehension. And yet, in the midst of annihilation, a fragile glimmer of strategy persisted. Small, desperate counterattacks continued, civilians and soldiers alike moving with a determination born of survival. The anomaly's pursuit was relentless, yes, but it also revealed itself in ways that might be studied, understood, and perhaps one day countered. For now, though, the Imperium was being hunted, the galaxy left to witness a force beyond reason, beyond faith, and beyond the reach of even the Emperor's guiding light. From the throne room on Terra, the faintest pulse of the Astronomicon stretched across the void, a fragile beacon of humanity's enduring presence. The golden light shimmered through the immensity of space, reaching out to fleet commanders, psychers, and devout souls across the segmentum. Yet even as it radiated, there was a weight to its glow, a strain born of centuries, the accumulated burden of mankind's sins, triumphs, and endless wars. The anomaly, moving through worlds like a storm incarnate, seemed undeterred, as though the Emperor's light was merely a distant lamp against the gathering night. High in the corridors of the Imperial Palace, the custodies whispered among themselves, their voices measured and reverent. They moved with precision, guarding the throne and ensuring the rituals that sustained the Emperor continued without interruption. Yet even they, embodiments of martial perfection and unwavering loyalty, sensed an imbalance. Reports from the segmentum had arrived in fragmented forms. Hive Tarsus consumed, manufactorums annihilated, fleets scattered. It was as if some force, ancient and unfathomable, had brushed against the foundations of the Imperium itself. The whispers of doubt, long buried beneath devotion, stirred among even the most disciplined guardians. Among the highest-ranking magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, debates raged. Some insisted the anomaly was a rogue fragment of a forgotten Xenos intelligence. Others spoke cautiously of it being a manifestation of the warp itself. No consensus could be reached, for the evidence was incomplete and the scale unprecedented. Yet all agreed on one point. The Emperor's shadow, the influence that had guided and protected humanity for millennia, was being tested in ways previously unimaginable. Every action in the segmentum was a ripple, every failure a mark upon the fabric of Imperial endurance. Fleet commanders desperate for guidance interpreted the faint pulses of the Astronomicon with strained minds. Orders were issued, recalled, and rewritten, yet none could match the speed or ferocity of the anomaly's advance. Layman ruses and battle barges attempted interception, and yet every engagement ended in catastrophe. Shields ruptured, hulls twisted, boarding parties annihilated. Each failure fed the growing despair among the ranks, a subtle corrosion of faith that reached even those trained to suppress doubt. On worlds where the populace still clung to ritual and prayer, temples overflowed with worshippers, their cries reaching toward Terra as though sheer volume could call the Emperor's hand to intervene. Chaplains raised relics and banners chanting litanies with unshakable determination. Yet each plea felt swallowed by the void. Even the most devout could not deny the scale of devastation, nor the suggestion that the Emperor's guiding shadow was stretched thin across a galaxy suddenly too vast, too chaotic to contain. And yet, in the shadows of despair, something remarkable persisted. Individuals, soldiers, citizens, priests, psychers, acted with courage that no calculation could predict. A regiment of guardsmen held a bridge against impossible odds, their bolters smoking, faith burning brighter than fear. A psyker channeled the Emperor's light into a defensive ward, sustaining survivors long enough to escape. These acts were fragments, tiny sparks against the inferno, yet they reminded the Imperium that the Emperor's influence, though strained, was not absent. It was subtle, dispersed, and manifested not as omnipotence, but as the persistence of humanity itself. Reports from distant worlds described the anomaly pausing, if only briefly, as if acknowledging these acts of defiance. It did not retreat, it did not hesitate out of mercy. It simply observed, calculating, measuring, and advancing. For the first time, Some whispered that the Emperor's shadow might have reached even the anomaly, subtle and pervasive, influencing events in ways impossible to verify. Was it guidance, coincidence, or merely perception shaped by desperate faith? The answer remained elusive, but the possibility breathed fragile hope into a galaxy being reshaped by fire, shadow, and unrelenting power. As night fell over the scarred segmentum, the Emperor's light shimmered faintly, casting long, tenuous shadows across the devastation. The anomaly pressed onward, indifferent and unstoppable, yet humanity endured. In the balance between destruction and persistence, between fear and faith, a subtle resonance emerged, a reminder that even in the face of incomprehensible power, the Emperor's shadow, however fragile, still stretched across the stars, linking mortal defiance to divine legacy, and shaping the final acts of a confrontation that would be remembered in legend and lament for millennia to come. The silence that followed was unlike any the Imperium had known. Hive Tarsus, once a throbbing heart of industry and life, now lay in smoldering ruins. Smoke curled from broken spires, the scent of charred flesh and promethium thick in the air, and the echoes of gunfire and psychic screams had long since faded into an oppressive stillness. Survivors moved through the ashes like ghosts, faces streaked with soot and despair, hands clutching relics, bolters, and anything that could anchor them to the remnants of reality. The anomaly had departed, but its presence lingered, a shadow etched into the very fabric of the world. Among the ruins, soldiers and Skitari alike struggled to comprehend what had survived. Entire regiments had been annihilated. Manufactorums that had endured centuries of war lay in molten ruin. Psychers, trembling and broken, whispered of visions that had left them irreparably altered. Children huddled beside corpses, their eyes wide with confusion and terror. And yet, amid the devastation, there was a thread of defiance. Small, tenuous, yet unbroken. Humans had endured incomprehensible loss before, and even when the galaxy seemed poised on the edge of annihilation, survival remained. Magos Dominus Calvrix walked among the debris with mechanical precision, cataloging every fragment of the encounter. Data slates recorded anomalies in energy dispersion, warp resonance, and psychic feedback. Each reading confirmed one undeniable truth. The entity had been more than a force of destruction. It had tested, observed, and challenged the Imperium in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond comprehension. Attempts to classify it as Xenos, demon, or rogue psyker were abandoned. The evidence refused simple categorization. The anomaly was something other, something older, something whose legacy would echo across the stars long after memory and history had failed. In the cathedral-like halls of the Ministorum, priests gathered the survivors, offering rites of mourning and prayers for deliverance. The liturgies were whispered, half for the souls lost and half for the living who still trembled. Chaplains spoke of faith not as certainty, but as perseverance, a candle held against the consuming darkness. In their eyes and in the eyes of those who listened, the lessons of this calamity were clear. The galaxy could be shattered, worlds could burn, and faith could waver. But the spirit of humanity endured because it refused to yield entirely. Reports filtered in from other worlds, each scarred by the anomaly's passage. Entire sectors had been reduced to skeletal remains, fleets scattered, psychers driven to madness. And yet in some places small victories persisted. Fleets had delayed its advance, civilians had survived in underground refuges, and isolated forces had struck back with ingenuity and ferocity. The Imperium had been tested to its limits, and though the cost was immense, fragments of resistance endured. These sparks, though tiny, were enough to remind all who survived that even the greatest force of destruction could not extinguish the will to exist. In the upper reaches of Terra, the Golden Throne continued its eternal vigil. The faint pulse of the Astronomicon stretched across the void, touching worlds in ruin and survival alike. The Emperor's shadow remained, subtle but perceptible, guiding, sustaining, and witnessing the endurance of humanity in the face of the incomprehensible. It was not victory. It was not reprieve. It was the quiet affirmation that even amid ashes, life and faith persisted, and in the void beyond the ruined worlds the anomaly moved on, leaving only silence, smoldering landscapes, and whispers in the warp. It had tested, it had destroyed, and it had observed. Its purpose remained unknowable, its judgment unspoken. The galaxy had glimpsed the edge of eternity, and in that glimpse it had learned the cost of defiance, the weight of perseverance, and the fragile, unyielding flame of human will. Among the ruins, Survivors stood, staring toward the distant stars, knowing that while the fires had passed, the shadow they left behind would endure in memory, myth, and the chronicles of the Imperium forever.